The wooden wheels of the stagecoach groaned under the weight of a dying sun. They hit a deep, jagged rut in the Montana dirt. The vehicle jolted violently. Leon clutched the handle of her weathered wooden trunk until her knuckles turned the color of bone. She felt the vibration deep in her teeth. On her back, she felt a familiar, comforting weight. It was the rhythmic, shallow breathing of her daughter. May was only 3 years old. She was a tiny blossom in a world of sharp thorns. The child was wrapped tightly in a red silk sling. The silk was a final gift from a grandmother in Guangdong. It was a splash of vibrant, defiant color. It stood out like a drop of blood against the drab brown of the frontier. Leon looked out the window at the endless horizon. The Montana Territory felt vast and hollow. It seemed like a giant waiting to swallow her whole. The sky was too big. The wind was too loud. If this ranch rejected her, she had nowhere else to go. She and her little girl would be sleeping in the dirt before the first Montana snow. The stagecoach finally slowed to a crawl. The horses blew thick plumes of steam from their nostrils. The driver shouted a rough command into the wind. The iron brakes screeched like a wounded animal. The world outside was silent and cold.
Leon stepped down onto the dusty, unforgiving ground. Her thin boots clicked against the dry earth. She adjusted the silk sling on her back. May stirred, but did not wake. Leon stood in front of a sprawling, lonely ranch. It looked tired. It looked like a place where hope went to rest. The house was built of heavy timber and cold gray stone. It stood defiant against the shadows of the Gallatin Mountains. The peaks were already capped with a warning of white snow. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and old secrets. A man was waiting for her in the yard. He stood near a tall, restless bay horse. The animal was pawing at the dirt, eager to run. The man was tall. His shoulders were broad, like an oak tree. He looked like he carried the weight of the entire sky on his back. His hat was pulled low over a weathered brow. His eyes were a piercing, lonely blue. This was Silas Thorne. He did not look like a master or a king. He did not look like a man who wanted a servant to command. He looked like a man who was slowly drowning in silence. Silas watched the small woman approach. He had expected someone different.
He thought he would see a sturdy girl from the Midwest, perhaps an older, hardened widow from the East. He did not expect this delicate creature. He saw a tiny woman with hair like raven silk. He saw a child strapped to her back like a precious burden. He looked at her weathered wooden trunk. He looked at her small, calloused hands. Silas took off his hat with a slow, hesitant motion. His brown hair was messy and shot through with streaks of gray. His forehead was lined with the deep grooves of a long grief. "You're the one from the paper?" he asked. His voice was like gravel rubbing together. It sounded like a voice that hadn't been used in a long, long time. Leon nodded slowly. She did not look away. She met his gaze with a quiet strength. "I am Leon," she said. Her English was careful. It was precise and measured. "I work hard," she continued. "I cook your meals. I clean your floors. I do not complain." Silas looked at the looming mountains. He looked back at the tiny woman standing in the dust.
"The pay ain't much, Leon," Silas said. He stepped toward his horse. "But you'll have a roof that doesn't leak. And the girl will be fed." Leon felt a sudden lump in her throat. The word fed sounded like a holy blessing. It was late October in the year 1884. The late October air was thin and sharp. Leon looked at the heavy wooden door of her new home. She thought about how she had gotten here. Guangdong was a lifetime away. The smell of the sea and the spice markets was a fading dream. 2 years ago, her world had collapsed into a pile of stone. Her husband had been a strong man. He had a laugh like thunder. He worked for the Central Pacific Railroad. He spent his days carving iron paths through mountains. A tunnel had given way in the high Sierras. The mountain took him. He died in the dark. He was buried beneath tons of cold, indifferent rock. He left her with 3 gold coins and a broken heart. He left her with a daughter who could barely remember the sound of his voice. In the city of San Francisco, Leon was invisible. She was just another widow in a land that didn't want her. The people looked at her with cold, suspicious eyes.
The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had changed everything. The air in the city became thick with a new kind of hatred. She had seen the posters plastered on the brick walls. "The Chinese must go," they screamed in bold black ink. She had heard the angry, drunken shouts echoing at night. She knew she had to leave before the darkness swallowed her whole. She found a tiny advertisement in the classified pages of a worn newspaper. "Help wanted," it read. "Strong woman for cooking and cleaning. Remote cattle ranch near Bozeman. Room and board provided. No questions asked." Leon didn't have any questions left to ask. She only had a desperate need for a roof and a locked door. Now she was in Montana. The first few weeks were a silent battle. It was a battle of shadows and old ghosts. Leon worked from the first light of dawn. She worked until the moon was high and cold. She found a rusted bucket and harsh lye soap. She scrubbed the floorboards on her hands and knees. She scrubbed until they shone like new copper pennies. The smell of neglect began to fade. It was replaced by the clean scent of pine and soap. She found Silas's old, tattered clothes in a heap. They were torn and forgotten. She sat by the fire every night. She mended the holes with tiny, perfect stitches. The repairs were so fine they were nearly invisible to the eye. She explored the dark corners of the pantry. She found bags of rice hidden in the back. She found strips of dried beef. She went to the creek and found wild, hidden herbs. She gathered wild onions and crisp watercress from the bank. She cooked things Silas had never imagined. The smell of ginger began to fill the cold kitchen. The scent of garlic wafted through the drafty halls. Nearly 2 months passed before Silas realized the ranch no longer felt empty. He had lost his wife, Clara, 3 years ago. The scarlet fever had been quick and merciless. It had been a thief in the night. Since then, the ranch had become a tomb of memories. The curtains were thick with the dust of neglect. The kitchen was a graveyard of empty tin cans. Stale bread sat like stone on the counter. Silas was a man of the land. He knew how to drive 1,000 head of cattle. He knew how to survive a mountain storm. But he did not know how to live anymore. He did not know how to make a house feel like a home. Now he ate his meals in a heavy silence. He stared at his plate as if it were a miracle. He wasn't used to flavor. He wasn't used to the radiating warmth of a busy kitchen. He wasn't used to the soft, rhythmic sound of life. Little May was a ray of unexpected light. She was a small sun in a dark, grieving house. She followed Silas to the barn like a curious shadow. Her tiny boots stumbled over the golden hay. At first, Silas tried to ignore her. He kept his head down, focused on his work. He checked the leather harnesses for wear. He brushed the horses until their coats gleamed. He was afraid. He was deeply afraid to look at the child. If he looked too closely, he might remember. He might remember the children he and Clara never had. But one afternoon, the heavy silence finally broke. Silas was in the main stall. He was tending to his fiercest, most dangerous stallion. The horse was black as a coal mine. It was wild and temperamental. The stallion trusted Silas, but it remained nervous around strangers. Silas had spent months teaching it not to strike at sudden movement. He heard a soft, high-pitched giggle. He turned his head slowly. May was standing just inches from the stall. She held a small handful of dry yellow grass. She reached out her tiny, trembling hand. She was trying to feed the enormous black stallion. Silas froze in place. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. One sudden strike or frightened lunge could badly hurt her. But the stallion didn't move. It lowered its massive head. It snorted softly, a warm puff of air. It breathed against her tiny, soft palm. It took the grass as gently as a prayer. Silas felt something shift in his chest. It felt like the ice of a long winter cracking in the spring. He moved quickly but quietly. He picked May up before she could be hurt. He didn't scold her. He didn't raise his voice in anger. He sat her safely on the top of the fence rail.
"You gotta be careful a little bit," he whispered. His voice was shaking with a hidden emotion. He showed her how to hold her hand perfectly flat. "Like this," he said.
"So he don't accidentally nip your fingers." Leon watched the scene from the kitchen window. She saw the massive man and the tiny girl. She saw his calloused hand shielding her small frame. She saw the golden sunlight hit his tired, worn face. For a brief moment, the world stopped turning. The ranch didn't feel like a place of work anymore. It didn't feel like a temporary refuge. It felt like the very first chapter of a new story. But the American frontier was a harsh and jealous judge. The land was wide, but rumors traveled on the wind. Word reached the bustling town of Bozeman. The people began to whisper at the general store. They whispered behind their lace fans at the church. They didn't like what they heard. Silas Thorne had brought a foreign element into their valley. They remembered the violence that had followed Chinese workers from one railroad town to another. They remembered the threats, the burned homes, and the families driven from places they had helped build. They saw Leon as a silent threat to their way of life. They saw her as an outsider who didn't belong in their dirt. One morning, the peace of the ranch was shattered. The sound of galloping hooves echoed in the yard. A group of local ranchers rode up in a cloud of dust. They stopped abruptly at the front fence. Their leader was a man named Miller.
Miller had a narrow mind and a heart of flint. He had a loud, booming voice meant to intimidate. "Thorne!" Miller shouted toward the house. He stayed high on his horse. He wanted to look down on the rest of the world. Silas walked out onto the porch. He was wiping grease and dirt from his hands. He had been in the shed, fixing a broken plow. Leon stayed inside, standing just behind the door. She clutched May tightly to her chest. Her heart was a frantic drum in her ears. "What do you want, Miller?" Silas asked. His voice was low and steady. It was the voice of a dangerous man. "We heard things, Silas," Miller sneered. He looked at the quiet house with disdain. "We heard you've got a Chinese woman living here. It ain't right, Silas. It brings a bad element to this valley. The law says they don't belong in this country." Silas stepped off the porch and into the dirt. He didn't reach for a gun. He didn't have to. His physical presence was a mountain in itself. He stood in the dust of his own land.
He looked up at the riders with cold eyes. "She's my employee, Miller," Silas said firmly. "She works harder than any 3 of your lazy men. She minds her own business, and what happens on my land is my affair alone." Miller spat a dark stream of tobacco on the ground. The juice hit the dust near Silas's boot. "You're making a terrible mistake, Thorne. People around here don't forget easily. We look after our own kind, and she sure as hell ain't one of us." They turned their horses in a violent swirl. They rode off, leaving a heavy cloud of dread behind. The silence that followed was suffocating. Leanne stepped out onto the porch. The autumn sun felt cold and thin on her skin. Her eyes were filled with unshed tears. She refused to let them fall in front of him. "I bring you nothing but trouble," she whispered. "I should leave tonight. I can take May and find a place in the city." Silas turned to look at her. He saw her small, fragile frame. He saw the fierce, motherly protectiveness in her eyes. He saw a courage he had never seen in a man.
"You ain't going nowhere, Leon," he said. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "The world is getting ugly. Some people just can't keep up with the truth, but you're staying right here on this ranch." The winter that stretched from 1884 into 1885 arrived with terrifying force. To the people trapped beneath its storms, it felt as if Montana had never known a colder season. The sky turned the heavy, flat color of lead. The wind howled through the timber walls of the house. It sounded like a wounded, dying animal. The snow didn't just fall from the sky, it attacked the earth. It piled up in massive drifts against the doors. It buried the windows until the world was gray. They were trapped inside a white prison. For days they saw nothing but the swirling frost. Silas spent his grueling hours in the barn. He fought a desperate war to keep the livestock alive. The cattle were shivering in the stalls. The horses were frosted over with layers of ice. He came back to the house late each night. He was covered in a thick crust of white. His face was a ghostly blue from the biting cold. His hands were stiff, gray, and utterly numb. Leon was always there, waiting by the door.
She had a hot, steaming bowl of soup ready. It was seasoned with the very last of her dried herbs. She would wrap his frozen hands in warm, soft cloths. One night, the blizzard reached its terrifying peak. The wind shook the very foundation of the stone house. The fireplace began to flicker and fail. The wood was damp from the sleet blowing down the flue. The chimney was finally blocked by a wall of solid ice. The fire died with a final, pathetic hiss. The house became an icebox within minutes. The temperature dropped until their breath hung in the air. Little May began to shiver violently. Her small teeth were chattering like castanets. Leon wrapped her in every heavy blanket they owned. She used her own wool coat to cover the child. It wasn't enough to stop the creeping frost. The cold was a predator, and it had found a way in. Silas saw the absolute desperation in Leon's eyes. He saw the primal fear a mother has for her child. He didn't say a single word. He went into his cold, dark bedroom. He dragged his heavy horsehair mattress into the main room. He placed it right in front of the frozen black hearth. "Get the girl," he commanded, with a voice of iron. "We have to stay together."
It's the only way to keep the body heat in. He lay down on one side of the mattress. Leon hesitated for a long, painful moment. She stood in the shadows of the freezing room. Her mother had once told her that no honorable widow should ever share a bed with another man. She could still hear those words as clearly as the winter wind. Leon looked down at May. The child's face was as pale as the snow outside. Her tiny lips were a faint, terrifying shade of blue. Pride would not keep her daughter's heart beating. Leon closed her eyes. She whispered a quiet apology to her late husband. Then she lay beside Silas. She held May tightly between their bodies. Silas pulled the heavy wool blankets over the three of them. He pulled a thick buffalo robe on top of it all. For the first time in 3 years, Silas felt a heartbeat. It wasn't the lonely thud of his own. He felt the radiating warmth of another human soul. Leon's hair smelled of wood smoke and dry earth. It was the scent of survival. He felt the tiny, rhythmic kick of May's foot. Outside, the world was ending in a chaotic swirl of ice. But inside, under the heavy robes, something was different. A new kind of warmth was beginning to bloom.
It was something more, the beautiful warmth of belonging. When the blizzard finally loosened its grip, the days remained bitterly cold, but the roads slowly opened again. Life on the ranch began to move forward. Silas began to teach Leon the ways of the high country. He showed her how to ride the powerful bay horse. She sat behind him, her arms tentatively holding his waist. He taught her how to hold a heavy Winchester rifle. "Line up the sights with the eye," he would say. "Breathe out slow before you pull the trigger." He wanted her to be able to protect the ranch. In return, Leon taught Silas how to see. She showed him how to look at the world through different eyes. "Look at the morning frost on the pane," she said. "It looks like the white plum flowers of my home." She taught him the sounds of her own language. She taught him san, the word for mountain in her native Cantonese. She taught him fo, the word for fire. He liked the way the unfamiliar words felt in his rough mouth. Soon, even the way he said her name carried a new softness. It made Leon's heart skip a beat every time he spoke. But the town of Bozeman had not forgotten them. The anger of the valley had only simmered like a pot of oil. In February, their winter supplies ran dangerously low.
Silas knew he had to ride into town. He tried to go alone to keep them safe, but Leon insisted on coming along.
May had a lingering heavy cough from the damp. They needed peppermint oil and a bottle of cough medicine. They rode into town on the heavy wooden wagon. The streets were a mess of slush and melting snow. When they entered the general store, the bell chimed. The entire room went instantly deathly silent. The local women pulled their long skirts away as she passed. They didn't want to touch the hem of her coat. The shopkeeper was a man named Joe. Silas had known him for over 20 years. Joe looked down at the wooden counter. He wouldn't look Silas in the eye. "I'll take the flour, Joe," Silas said. He placed his silver coins on the counter. "And the coffee and the cough medicine. It's for the little one." Joe didn't move a muscle. "I can't do it, Silas," Joe whispered. "I can't serve her kind in my store. They say if I sell to you, they'll burn me out." Silas felt a hot, blinding flash of rage. He reached across the counter with a lightning hand.
He grabbed Joe by the greasy collar. He pulled the man forward until their noses touched. "She's a widow," Silas hissed through his teeth. "She's a mother, and she's a human being. She works my land, and she eats my bread, and she's a better person than anyone in this room." Leon stepped forward, her face calm. She placed her small hand on Silas's tensed arm. "Silas, no," she whispered. "Do not do this for me. Do not lose your oldest friends because of me." Silas looked down at her. He saw the deep, hidden pain in her eyes. He slowly let go of Joe's collar. Silas took his silver coins back from the counter. "I guess I don't need your flour, Joe," Silas said. "I'll ride all the way to Helena if I have to." They walked out of the store together. They held their heads high against the stairs. But as they reached the wagon, a sound broke the air. A jagged rock whistled through the cold wind. It struck Leon directly on her forehead. She just gasped, a sharp intake of breath. A thin, bright line of blood ran down her face. Her knees almost gave way.
She caught herself against the wagon wheel before she fell. Silas roared in a fury that shook the street. He reached for the leather holster at his hip. His hand gripped the cold handle of his revolver. Leon caught his hand with a surprising strength. "No, Silas." She looked at the gathering crowd. Miller was among them, leading the pack. He was smiling a cruel, thin, satisfied smile. Leon looked at their angry, twisted faces. She saw a pathetic, hollow fear. "Let's go home, Silas," she said quietly. "Please, let's just go home." Only after the wagon had disappeared beyond the hill did her hands begin to shake. That evening they sat in the warm kitchen. The fire was crackling happily in the stone hearth. May was fast asleep in her small bed. Silas brought a bowl of warm, clear water. He brought a clean, white cloth. He knelt on the floor in front of Leon. He gently wiped the dried blood from her skin. His hand trembled. He had faced stampedes and blizzards without fear, but seeing her hurt broke something inside him. "I'm so sorry, Leon," he said.
His voice broke, a sound of pure agony. This country was supposed to be a new start. Leon looked at him, her eyes soft. "The country is just land, Silas," she said. "It is the people who choose to make it kind." Silas reached out with a trembling hand. He touched her small, scarred hand. "I don't want you to be my servant anymore," he said. Leon felt her heart stop in her chest. She thought this was the final end. She thought the town had finally broken his will. She began to stand up, her legs shaking. "I understand, Silas," she whispered. "I will pack my bags tonight. I will leave with May in the morning light." But Silas didn't let go of her hand. He pulled her until their knees touched on the floor. "No," he said, his voice like iron. "That's not what I mean at all, Leon. I want you to stay here forever, not as a servant to clean my floors, but as my wife, as the mother of this house, as my partner in everything I own." Leon looked at him, searching for the truth. "Are you truly certain?" she asked. "A lonely man can still survive, but a man with a Chinese wife, they may never forgive you." Silas leaned in, closing the final gap. He kissed her forehead, right on the scar. He kissed the spot where the rock had struck her. "Let them try," he whispered against her skin. "You brought the sun back into this dark house. I ain't never letting that go again."
May stirred in her little bed. She opened her sleepy eyes and saw Silas kneeling beside her mother. The child slipped from beneath her blanket. She padded across the floor and reached both arms toward him. "Papa," she whispered. She had never called Silas that before. Silas went perfectly still. Tears filled his eyes before he even realized they were there. Leanne leaned her head against his broad chest. She listened to the steady beat of his heart. It sounded like a sacred promise kept. The wedding was small and quiet. It was held in the middle of a blooming spring. Leanne wore her finest red silk dress. It was a bridge between her past and her future.
Silas wore a look of absolute, unshakable pride. The townspeople still whispered in the shadows. Some still turned away when they passed, but no one dared throw another stone. But others slowly began to see a real family where there had once been only loneliness. They began to understand that love could reach deeper than borders. As the years passed, the Thorn Ranch changed. Leon started a small schoolhouse on the ranch. She taught the children the value of kindness. She told them a story every single Friday, the story of a widow who traveled the entire world, and a widow who found a kingdom in the dirt. One evening, many years later, they sat on the porch. The sun was setting behind the purple Gallatin peaks. Silas put his arm around Leon's shoulders. "You still happy you stayed in this wild place?" he asked. Leon looked out at the vast, beautiful land. "I didn't just stay here, Silas," she said. "I finally arrived. I found the only place I was ever meant to be." The wind blew softly across the Montana plains. It carried the scent of pine and wild roses. It was a story of a love stronger than any hate. It was a story of a home built on the foundation of grace. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us your favorite moment in the comments. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories of the American frontier, please subscribe. This story is inspired by historical research and frontier life in the American West. Some characters and events have been fictionalized for storytelling. Visuals may include AI-assisted imagery and digital artistry. Until next time, God bless.